In 1983, a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army sat down and wrote a 29-page declassified report for the CIA explaining how human consciousness could theoretically transcend space and time. This is the story of the Gateway Process, a classified government program that attempted to unlock the secrets of out-of-body experiences and the decades-long rabbit hole of psychic espionage, secret code names, and a mysteriously missing page 25 that surrounds it. The Cold War was a strange time. Both superpowers were locked in an arms race that extended far beyond nuclear warheads and intercontinental ballistic missiles. By the early 1970s, American intelligence agencies had learned something deeply unsettling. The Soviet Union was pouring enormous sums of money into what they called psychotronic research. We're talking about telepathy, clairvoyance, the ability to perceive distant locations using nothing but the mind. Between 1969 and 1971, U.S. intelligence concluded the Soviets were spending roughly 60 million rubles per year on this research. By 1975, that number had ballooned to over 300 million. Whether or not any of it actually worked was almost beside the point. The Soviets believed it might, and in the logic of Cold War paranoia, that was enough. If there was even a slim chance that psychic abilities were real and could be weaponized, America could not afford to fall behind. The spark that truly set things in motion was a book. In 1970, two journalists named Sheila Ostrander and Lynn Schroeder published Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain, and it sent shockwaves through the intelligence community. This groundbreaking expose of Soviet parapsychology research became the catalyst for American psychic research programs. One journalist would later dub what followed the race for inner space. By 1972, the CIA had approved funding for a classified program known as Scientifc, the precursor to what would become a multi-decade investigation into the weaponization of human consciousness. Government-funded research on the frontiers of human consciousness was officially underway. Now, to understand where all of this leads, you need to understand a man named Robert Monroe. Born in 1915 in Indiana, Monroe grew up in an intellectually curious household. His mother was a non-practicing medical doctor who played cello and piano. His father was a professor of Romance languages who led summer tours to Europe. Monroe himself went into radio broadcasting, building a successful career as an executive. But in 1958, something happened that would change the trajectory of his entire life. He began experiencing what he described as a state of consciousness, completely separate from his physical body. He wasn't dreaming. He wasn't hallucinating, at least not in his view. He was, as he came to describe it, having an out-of-body experience. That term, OBE, which is now used across consciousness literature, was actually popularized by Monroe himself. In 1971, he published a book called Journeys Out of the Body, documenting hundreds of these experiences in meticulous detail. But Monroe wasn't content to simply write about what was happening to him. He wanted to understand the mechanism. Back in 1956, his company had set up a research and development division to study how sound patterns affect human consciousness, including whether people could learn while sleeping. By 1974, this research had evolved into the Monroe Institute of Applied Sciences, an organization dedicated entirely to the exploration of human consciousness. A year later, Monroe was issued the first of 3 patents for a technique he called frequency following response, the foundation of what became known as Hemi Sync. Hemi Sync, short for hemispheric synchronization, is an audio technology based on the principle of binaural beats. When slightly different sound frequencies are played into each ear, the brain perceives a third frequency, a kind of phantom tone that can guide brain waves into specific states. Monroe's claim was that by synchronizing the left and right hemispheres of the brain, you could promote mental well-being, or, more provocatively, trigger altered states of consciousness. The technique formed the backbone of what Monroe called the Gateway Experience, a structured training system using guided meditation and carefully engineered sound patterns to progressively move participants through different focus states. Focus 10 was described as the mind-awake, body-asleep state. Focus 12 was a state of expanded awareness. Focus 15 was what Monroe called no time, a state of simply being, where consciousness supposedly expands beyond the limitations of the 5 physical senses. Focus 21 represented the bridge to other energy systems and dimensions entirely. The first gateway program for personal consciousness exploration was held in 1977 with 40 participants. That same year, Monroe renamed his organization simply the Monroe Institute and moved operations to a larger property in the foothills of Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains. And that's where the government comes in. In 1977, the same year Monroe was running his first Gateway program, a secret United States Army unit was being established at Fort Meade, Maryland, funded jointly by the Defense Intelligence Agency and the Stanford Research Institute. This unit would go through a dizzying number of codenames over the years: Gondola Wish, Grill Flame, Center Lane, Sunstreak, and eventually, the name by which it became publicly known, the Stargate Project. The roster of people involved reads like something out of a Cold War thriller. Harold Pudoff and Russell Targ at Stanford Research Institute were the scientists running the experiments. Among their subjects were some genuinely colorful characters. There was Ingo Swann, an artist, author, and former Scientologist who is credited with coining the term remote viewing. Swann developed a structured set of protocols called coordinate remote viewing, or CRV, that turned what had been casual psychic experimentation into something resembling a repeatable methodology with specific stages and procedures. Then there was Pat Price, a former police officer from Burbank, California, and also a former Scientologist who joined the program after a chance encounter with Pudoff and Swann near SRI. Price's very first assignment became one of the CIA's earliest operational remote viewing tests and one of the program's most celebrated successes. He was asked to describe a suspected underground nuclear testing site in the Soviet Union, known internally by the codename PNUTS. Working from maps and photographs, Price produced sketches of cranes and gantries that appeared to correspond with actual CIA intelligence photographs of the site. There was even Uri Geller, the celebrity psychic famous for bending spoons. For 8 days in August 1973, Geller was locked in a room at SRI while officials ran experiments to test his purported supernatural abilities. But the most storied remote viewer of them all was Joseph McMoneagle, a U.S. Army veteran who became known as Remote Viewer Number 1. McMoneagle worked with Project Stargate from 1978 to 1984 and was involved in an astonishing 450 missions. He specialized in near-death experiences, out-of-body travel, and even unidentified flying objects. In 1982, McMoneagle attended a gateway course at the Monroe Institute and reported that it significantly improved his preparation time for remote viewing sessions and made his results more reliable. At its peak during the mid-1980s, the program included as many as 7 full-time viewers, along with analytical and support personnel. The operation was overseen by Major General Albert Stubblebine, a key military sponsor who believed deeply in the potential of psychic warfare and human potential enhancement. Over its lifetime, more than 40 personnel served in the program, including about 23 remote viewers. The total budget over more than 2 decades exceeded $20 million, with $11 million of that spent between the mid-1980s and early 1990s. And there were moments that seemed to genuinely defy explanation. By far, the most celebrated case occurred during an operation called Grill Flame, when a young woman named Rosemary Smith was asked to locate a downed Soviet aircraft somewhere in Africa. Smith studied her maps and made notations. Technicians converted those notations into geographical coordinates and sent them to the CIA station chief in Zaire. 2 days later, the Soviet aircraft was found exactly where Smith said it would be, allowing the agency to extract valuable enemy technology. Cases like these were internally referred to as 8 martini results, a term meaning the data was so mind-boggling that everyone involved had to go out and drink 8 martinis just to recover. Meanwhile, back at the Monroe Institute, the military's interest in the Gateway experience was intensifying. On August 23, 1983, a memorandum was sent to Major General Albert Stubblebine, a key sponsor of the psychic research programs at Fort Meade. The memo concerned a Monroe Institute seminar featuring the Mark V program, described as the latest improvement over the original Gateway experience. And that brings us to the document at the heart of this story. On June 9, 1983, Lieutenant Colonel Wayne M. McDonnell completed his report, Analysis and Assessment of the Gateway Process. McDonnell had been tasked by the commander of the U.S. Army Operational Group with a deceptively simple question: figure out how the Gateway experience, astral projection, and out-of-body experiences actually work. To do this, McDonnell partnered with several collaborators, most notably Itzhak Bentov, an American-Israeli scientist who had helped pioneer the biomedical engineering industry. The resulting 29-page report is one of the strangest documents the U.S. government has ever produced. McDonnell approached the subject from every conceivable scientific angle: biomedical inquiry to understand the physical aspects of the process, quantum mechanics to describe the nature of consciousness, theoretical physics to explain the space-time dimension, and classical physics to bring the entire phenomenon of out-of-body states into the language of measurable science. The report's central claim is extraordinary. It describes the gateway experience as a training system designed to focus brainwave output in order to alter consciousness and, ultimately, escape the restrictions of time and space. McDonnell wrote that when a person achieves the out-of-body state, they are projecting what he called that eternal spark of consciousness and memory, which constitutes the ultimate source of his identity, allowing it to, and I'm quoting directly here, play in and learn from dimensions both inside and outside the time-space world in which his physical component currently enjoys a short period of reality. The report essentially argues that consciousness participates in an all-knowing, infinite continuum, a characteristic of energy in what it calls the ever-present. It reads less like a government intelligence assessment and more like a philosophical treatise dressed in military formatting. And then there's the mystery of page 25. When the CIA declassified the Gateway Report in 2003, one page was conspicuously absent. Page 25. Since its release, countless Freedom of Information Act requests have been filed demanding the missing page. In every instance, the CIA has denied they ever had it. This denial naturally only fueled speculation about what the page might contain. The missing page became something of a holy grail for conspiracy theorists and consciousness researchers alike. And then, in a twist almost too perfect for fiction, the Monroe Institute itself announced that page 25 had been sitting in their own archives in Virginia all along. The page eventually made its way to a journalist via email one evening, a digital attachment that felt, as the journalist described it, like an unceremonious entrance for a document produced 38 years earlier and sought after by thousands. Now, it's important to step back and acknowledge the other side of this story. Critics, and there are many, argue that the Gateway Report proves nothing. It is, they say, not a secret government confession that psychic phenomena are real. It is exactly what its title suggests: an assessment. One curious officer listened to the Monroe Institute's pitch, tried to make sense of it, and wrote down his thoughts. The document reads more like a thought experiment than a scientific report. At no point does it offer experimental proof. At no point does it confirm that astral projection is real. The broader Stargate project faced similar skepticism. In 1995, the CIA commissioned the American Institutes for Research to conduct a comprehensive review of the entire program. The statistician Jessica Utz maintained there had been a statistically significant positive effect, with some subjects scoring 5 to 15% above chance, concluding that psychic functioning had been scientifically established. But fellow reviewer Ray Hyman argued that concluding ESP had been proven was, quote, premature to say the least, citing methodological flaws and the lack of replicable results. David Marks, another critic, identified 6 negative design features in the experiments, including the possibility of sensory leakage and the impossibility of peer review for experiments conducted in secret. He concluded the entire project was nothing more than a subjective delusion. The AIR review's bottom line was damning. No remote viewing report had ever provided actionable information for any intelligence operation. Based on these findings, the CIA terminated the $20 million project, citing a lack of documented evidence that the program had any value to the intelligence community. But not everyone agreed with that conclusion. Dale Graff, one of the project's own investigators, expressed bafflement at the announcement that the program was a failure. In his experience, it had seemed to produce definite successes. His observation, though, came with a telling caveat. Military and intelligence authorities had never really taken the project seriously enough to act on its findings. It's a kind of catch-22. The program couldn't prove its value because no one would use its results, and no one would use its results because the program couldn't prove its value. As of 1995, when the project was officially shuttered, Time magazine reported that 3 full-time psychics were still working on a $500,000 annual budget at Fort Meade. The story might have ended there, a curious footnote in Cold War history, except the internet had other plans. In January 2017, the CIA declassified some 12 million pages of records through their CREST archive that revealed previously unknown details about the program. And then, around 2021, TikTok discovered the Gateway Report. The document went viral, racking up millions of views as young users not only shared news of the report, but began documenting their own attempts to use the Gateway process. A 1983 Army intelligence document had somehow become a social media sensation nearly 4 decades after it was written. The Monroe Institute, meanwhile, is still very much operational, sitting on over 300 acres of rolling Virginia countryside. About 3 hours from Washington, D.C., the Institute continues to offer its Gateway Voyage programs, now available both in person and online. They describe their mission as pioneering safe, structured methods for exploring expanded states of consciousness. For over 50 years, they've been at it. And the government hasn't entirely walked away from this territory either. In 2014, the Office of Naval Research launched a 4-year, $3.85 million program to explore the use of premonition and intuition among sailors and Marines. They called it Exploring the Sixth Sense. Officially, of course, it had nothing to do with psychic powers. Unofficially, the echoes of Stargate are hard to miss. So, what do we make of all this? $20 million, spent over 2 decades, dozens of personnel, hundreds of missions, moments of apparent, inexplicable success, followed by an official verdict of failure, a classified report that reads like mystical philosophy wrapped in quantum physics, a missing page found in a Virginia archive, and a new generation discovering it all through 15-second videos on their phones. The CIA's Gateway Report doesn't prove that consciousness can transcend space and time, but it does prove something arguably just as interesting, that for a significant period during the Cold War, the most powerful intelligence agencies in the world took the possibility seriously enough to fund it, staff it, classify it, and ultimately, when they couldn't explain what they'd found, quietly shut it down and walk away. What they left behind are questions that, 40 years later, still don't have clean answers. And maybe that's the point. The Gateway process was never just about leaving your body. It was about confronting the limits of what we think we know. And those limits, it turns out, are far stranger than most of us are comfortable admitting.